Well, we're continuing on in Genesis today. Important to remember, as we go forward here, these stories are all foundational, in God's plan of salvation. These characters that God has chosen, reveal a lot of different things. It reveals our sinful nature, but it reveals a sovereign God that is going to work his will and purpose no matter what. Well, we're up to chapter 28 today, and chapter 27 was the account of Rebekah and Jacob tricking Isaac into giving his blessing to Jacob instead of to Esau. And in looking at all the characters in this story, it becomes clear again that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob uses some very imperfect people to accomplish his will and purpose. And we see that through the whole Bible, that those that are in the end going to be regarded as heroes of the faith are people that have messed up at some point. And that was true of Abraham. It will prove to be true of Moses and David. You think of the prophet Jonah, Jesus' disciples, especially Peter, how they scattered, and Peter, of course, betraying Jesus, but then being used mightily by God in spreading the gospel. Because Isaac and Rebekah and Esau and Jacob had their own agendas, and they didn't just simply trust God and submit to his plan, now there's going to be some consequences, mostly having to do with broken relationships. Isaac's family has been broken. Jacob has to flee from Esau for fear of his life, which means that now Rebekah would never see her son Jacob again. And we aren't told exactly how this affected Isaac and Rebekah's relationship when Isaac figures out that Rebekah has been conspiring with Jacob. And all of this illustrates for us the danger of forcing our will into situations rather than waiting for God to do things his way. As Jacob is set to flee from his home, Isaac calls for him and tells him again to not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan, but to go to the house of Rebekah's father Bethuel and take a wife from one of the daughters of Rebekah's brother Laban. And Isaac's parting blessing to Jacob is, "And God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may be a multitude of people." So the blessing of the Abrahamic covenant has been passed on now to Jacob. The house of Bethuel was in a region called Padan Aram, which is actually modern-day Syria. And Jacob sets out to basically take that same journey that Abraham's servant Eliezer had taken when he went to find a wife for Isaac. Now remember that Esau has already taken wives from among the Canaanites. And when he realizes that his father Isaac doesn't approve, and when he finds out that Isaac has told Jacob to not take a wife from among the Canaanites, he thinks that he's going to try to bring some help and healing to his relationship with his father. He tries once more to please Isaac by taking another wife, but in the process shows that he doesn't understand the covenant that God had made with his grandfather Abraham, and he takes a wife that was the daughter of Ishmael. Now, this wife wasn't a Canaanite, but of course she wasn't from the chosen line of Isaac, the child of promise. So this attempt of Esau to please Isaac falls empty. Jacob now is traveling towards Haran, where the house of Bethuel is. And when evening comes, he picks a spot to spend the night, and it says that he took a stone to use for a pillow and lays down to sleep. I'm not real surprised that that idea of stones for pillows didn't really catch on. But in spite of a very hard pillow, Jacob falls asleep, and in verses 12 to 18 it says, Jacob had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And there above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. And of course, that's reference again to Jesus. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. And he was afraid, and he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. And early the next morning, Jacob took the stone that he had placed under his head, and he set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. And he called that place Bethel. You know, some of you might remember the song we used to sing in Sunday school, We Are Climbing Jacob's Ladder. You know, I think it was sung a lot at Bible camp too, sitting around the campfires. Now, somewhere along the way, that song got blacklisted because it was thought to be theologically incorrect. You know, the picture of climbing a ladder to heaven was thought to suggest that somehow we can work our way to heaven, which of course we can't. So, if you haven't heard that song for a while, that's probably why. But Jacob names this place Bethel, and Bethel means the house of God. So God repeats and confirms the promise to Jacob that he had first made to Abraham and then to Isaac. And one thing to note here is that God is promising Jacob that this very location is part of the promised land, part of the covenant land. It's part of the land that the Israelites later will return to after 430 years in slavery, and then of course 40 years in the wilderness. And today, Bethel is part of modern day Israel. It's just north of Jerusalem. So God promises to be with Jacob wherever he goes. You know, in Matthew 28:20, Jesus gives that same promise to his disciples, and he gives it to us, his church. He says, lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. I once heard of someone that quoted this to a person that was afraid of flying, but the person took no comfort from it because they noted that Jesus said, lo, I am with you always. You know, they were quite sure that he didn't necessarily mean that he would be with them at 38,000 feet. But all jokes aside, the fact that Jesus is always with us is one of the greatest promises that we have. We are never alone. This encounter with God has a big impact on Jacob, and he vows that Yahweh will be his God, and that he will give a tenth of all that he has. So Jacob arrives at a well in Haran where his uncle Laban lives, and Laban's daughter Rachel is there tending sheep. And she runs to tell her father that Jacob is there. Laban comes to meet him, and a new adventure begins for Jacob. Laban and Jacob negotiate the terms for Jacob, working for Laban. And evidently, Jacob was immediately smitten with Rachel, and he says that he will serve Laban for 7 years in exchange for the hand of his daughter Rachel. And at the end of 7 years, Jacob goes to Laban to remind him that he has fulfilled his end of the bargain. And Laban puts together a big feast, like a wedding celebration. But Laban then tricks Jacob, and after the feast, Jacob goes into what he thinks is Rachel's tent, only to find out in the morning that he's with Rachel's older sister Leah. Now Jacob is understandably angry, but Laban now claims that the local custom is that the younger can't marry before the older. He just didn't happen to mention that ahead of time. Now Jacob the trickster has been tricked. And because of God's promise to Jacob that he would prosper, Laban has been benefiting financially from having Jacob there, and he knows it, so he's not anxious to have Jacob leave. And Laban tells Jacob that if he agrees to work for him another 7 years, that he can also have Rachel as his wife. And Jacob loves Rachel. He agrees to stay. In fact, stays longer than that other 7 years. You know, one of the sad parts of this story is that Leah realizes that Jacob loves Rachel and doesn't really love her. And it says that God sees her pain, and then to compensate, he opens her womb. You know, for women to bear children back then was really important. It's kind of where they got their value. Well, as with, okay, I lost my place. So Leah has 4 sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And Rachel, in the meantime, is barren, and it says, or some do the math, and it looks like it might be about 20 years that she goes without having children. And that causes her to be jealous of Leah, and it also causes some conflict between her and Jacob. And as with Abraham and Sarah, the custom of the day was that a barren woman could have children through their servants. Now Rachel's servant Bilhah will bear 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Leah then gives her servant Zilpah to Jacob as a wife, and Zilpah bears 2 sons, Gad and Asher. And then Leah conceives again and 2 more sons, Issachar and Zebulun. And you'll recognize these names as the names of the tribes of Israel. And that's 10 so far, and of course there'll be 2 more. But in chapter 30, it says that God remembers Rachel, and she finally conceives and has a son, and she names that son Joseph. Jacob has fulfilled his obligation to Laban and then some, and so he tells Laban that it's time to take his wives and children and go to their own country. And Laban realizes that he has prospered because of Jacob's presence and because of his work. And again, he's reluctant to see him leave, but at this point, he doesn't have a legitimate reason to not let him go. Now, Jacob the trickster proposes a plan to Laban as a way to get paid for his time there. He proposes that he goes through the flocks and herds and takes all of the speckled and spotted cattle, the brown sheep, and the spotted and speckled goats. And typically, these would be the minority of the animals. Well, Laban jumps on that deal, but now he pulls another trick of his own, and immediately he removes all those animals that have abnormal color and gives them to his sons. Well, Jacob doesn't leave right away. He continues to care for Laban's animals. And it says that he takes rods of green poplar and hazel and chestnut, and he partially peels them so they have white stripes. And kind of an interesting little tidbit here is that the exposed white stripes on the rods in Hebrew were called Laban, same name as his uncle. Well, there's a theory that whatever a sheep will fix their attention on when they are mating will affect the markings of the young. So Jacob sets these rods in front of the animals in the water troughs, and he watches for the strongest in the flocks when they were mating and puts these rods in front of them, and then he'd remove the rods when the weaker ones in the flock were mating. And lo and behold, the cattle and sheep and goats give birth to young that were striped and speckled and spotted. I really seriously doubt that there's any real science in all this, but that the results were because of God again blessing Jacob so that he would be able to separate, move back to Canaan, back to the land that had been promised to him. Well, in this game between Laban and Jacob to see who could out-trick the other, Laban ends up more or less getting what he has coming. He had long taken advantage of Jacob. The result of all this, though, was hard feelings and broken relationships. Both Laban and his sons now were angry at Jacob. And now God would use their ill will as a motivator to cause Jacob to leave. And that's where we're going to pick up the story next week. But again, this story is all part of a divine plan that will culminate in the fulfilled promise of a Messiah, the one that will suffer and die and rise from the dead. And it's all because God so loves the world and because he wants everyone to be saved. Amen.